I am Karlijn de Mazure. I am Professor Emeritus at St. Paul University, and I am the founding director of the Center for Safeguarding Minors and Vulnerable Persons. Today we are going to talk about a topic that is quite delicate. It's about sexual abuse. And to make sure we understand well what sexual abuse means, we are going to talk today about the terms and definitions. First of all, people think that sexual abuse doesn't happen very much, but that's wrong. There is much more sexual abuse than is believed and detected. If we look at international studies, for instance, the World Health Organization, 20% of women and 5 to 10% of men are victims of sexual abuse before the age of 18. So that means that even if you are in a classroom with students, a number of them have been abused before the age of 18. Prevention measures are needed at the level of individuals, groups and associations, as well as society. Everywhere we have to do prevention. But we are talking about, I said, it's the Center for the Protection of Minors, but what's a minor? A minor includes children and adolescents who are under the age of 18, but also people who have a mental and cognitive disability. Even if they have reached the age of 18, they may not be able to make informed decisions about important matters and therefore cannot be seen as fully responsible for their choices and actions. They are dependent on others to lead a normal life. But let's see what we use as a definition in the Catholic Church. So we have a definition in Vos Estis Lux Mundi. And you see I put there 2023 March. Indeed, the former version of Vos Estis Lux Mundi was made in 2019, but it was ad experimentum, just for 3 years. But now in March, the Pope had made it, I won't say eternal, but has made it universal, and it is also valid now for an indefinite time unless a new document will be written. So what does the document says about being a minor? It means any person under the age of 18 years. And as we have explained a moment ago, it is also a person habitually with imperfect use of reason. That person is equated with a minor. So now, what is a vulnerable adult? I have to point again to the former version, because there we were talking about vulnerable persons. In the new version, person has been replaced by adult, because otherwise you include again the minors. So now it is adult, and it means any person in a state of infirmity, physical or mental deficiency, or deprivation of personal liberty that in fact, even occasionally, limits his or her capacity to understand or otherwise resist the offense. We see, in fact, if I try to explain it, I say you see like 2 levels in this. The first level is, it is more structural. You are born or during your life, you get a physical or mental deficiency. But the second part is situational. You can be a vulnerable adult in a certain situation. For instance, if you are in the hospital and you need surgery, or you are in pastoral care and someone is taking care of you and eventually is abusing you. In other words, all of us will be a vulnerable adult at a certain moment in life. Even old age is a period, a situation in which we are vulnerable and depend on others. So sexual abuse is not only about sexuality. It is about sexuality, of course, the term says it, but in fact it's an abuse on 4 levels. And we are going to elaborate that, but let's first define the 4 levels. First of all, it's an abuse of power. it's an abuse of trust, it is a sexual transgression, and it is spiritual abuse. So let's go to the first. It is an abuse of power. What is power? The power is the capacity to make the other act conform one's own will. Power is the possibility to influence the thoughts, the feelings, and the behavior of someone else. Power manifests itself within a relationship, hence it is a relational concept. Power is neutral. You can use it in a good or in a bad way, but as such it's not bad. So if I look at my own life, for instance, we as parents, we use lots of power to influence the feelings and the behavior and the thoughts of our kids. That's education. So normally that's a positive use of power. But you can use it in a way that you dominate the other, that you take away the freedom of the other. And then, of course, it's not a good use of power, but an abuse of power. So in a relation, every time, both parties have power, but mostly in an asymmetric way. And one can speak of domination when the power of one person eliminates the freedom of the other. So even in cases of abuse, the other has a certain power, but the relationship can be so asymmetric that it limits the freedom of the other. And that is what always happens in sexual abuse. It is a form, a way of abusing power. Because if the other one would not have power over you, you would not be abused. Imagine a father and his daughter. The abuse of power, it is the adult abuses his or her power in order to dominate the minor or to receive sexual gratifications against the will of the minor. Even if the minor, and I will come back to that, even if the minor says yes, this yes is not valid because the minor is not mature and is not able to give you an informed consent. So even if you think it is the will of the minor or someone is trying to convince you of that, that's absolutely not true. So the adult abuses his power to dominate the minor, and sometimes it's not even about sexual gratification. Some also abuse their power without sex, but just for the joy of the domination and to humiliate the other. The adult uses his or her power to manipulate or coerce the minor or the adult into sexual acts while the minor or the adult is unable to fully understand or freely consent to those acts. Well, we have all those situations from what we call the new religious communities, like there were many in France, where we have seen that adults were not able to say no. They were so manipulated, they were so under the power of the leader of the community that they were not able to say no. So they did maybe understand, but they were not able to consent, to give them a valid consent. When the power imbalance is used to abuse, victims feel very helpless, and often they hold this feeling for a very long time. I imagine one of the situations of an adult in such a community who, when she wanted to run away, she had forgotten how to live. She didn't know the worth of money anymore. She didn't know where to go because they isolate you as well. So you have no relationships anymore, no one who can help you. So they feel very helpless. But it's not only about power, and I cannot insist enough about the fact that it is also an abuse of trust, because normally abuse happens in a relationship, and in a relationship in which the person who is abused, in fact, trusted the other one and couldn't imagine that the other one was going to abuse her. But what is trust? It is a capacity to rely on someone, to put your faith in someone. And you know, if you trust someone, that the action will correspond to the words spoken. To know also that one will not be harmed by the other. That is trust. And in a situation of abuse, the trust is abused, and you can ask every therapist, they will tell you that the thing that is the most difficult to heal is trust, so that can people trust again. Sexual abuse is usually committed by people the victims know and trust, and intrafamilial abuse is by far the most common type of sexual abuse. That is true, but that is not a reason. This is not an excuse not to talk about the abuse in the church. We know there is abuse in sports, there's abuse in the world of Hollywood, there is abuse in the church, there is abuse in the family, and every abuse should be treated within its own context and looking at the reason, the causes of this abuse. A second abuse occurs when a minor reports the abuse and is not believed, or an adult, and can even be more difficult for an adult to report abuse and to be believed, because very often people say, yeah, but you are an adult, why did you not simply say no? But in that case, they do not take into account the grooming, the manipulation by the abuser that takes away the freedom of the other. So I think we are now ready to read a definition of child sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is defined as the involvement of a child in a sexual activity that he or she does not fully comprehend, is unable to give informed consent to, or for which the child is not developmentally prepared, or else that violates the laws or social taboos of society. Children can be sexually abused by both adults and other children who are, by virtue of their age or stage of development, in a position of responsibility, trust, or power over the victim. You see there again those words, trust and power, that are very important, but you also see that a child is not able to consent, to give an informed consent, because it is not mature. The yes of a child and even the yes of an adult who is in a vulnerable situation is not a valid consent, and by consequence it is abuse. I really like very much this definition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church about what is sexuality. Well, they say sexuality affects all aspects of the human person in the unity of his body and soul. It especially concerns affectivity, the capacity to love and to procreate, and in more general way, the aptitude for forming bonds of communion with others. That is what sexuality is. And all those aspects of the human person are damaged by the abuse. You lose the unity between body and soul because of dissociation. You have problems with affectivity. To love someone, many cannot procreate or do not want to procreate anymore, and it is also very difficult for them to have relationships with others because of the lack of trust in other human beings. Further, many people think that sexual abuse has only to do with hands-on. And of course, hands-on is important, but it is also broader than just penetration. For instance, hands-on is touching, fondling, genital manipulation, penetrative action, oral or anal or vaginal, and child prostitution. All those are forms of sexual abuse hands-on. But even if there is no touching, no direct contact, we can talk about sexual abuse. For instance, if someone performs sexual activities in front of the child, if pictures or photos are taken, sexual photos of a child, if there is verbal sexual harassment, and if our actions are undertaken that enable child prostitution. It would not be the first time that someone says, I didn't abuse the child because there was no penetration. So we have already seen it's an abuse of power, it's an abuse of trust, it's a sexual transgression, and now we come to point 4. It is also a spiritual abuse. It is sexual abuse always touches the spirituality of a person. Because the person, for instance, the child will say, I was praying to God that it should stop, that my father was abusing me, but it never stopped. So they lose their trust in God. But it is even more a spiritual abuse if it happens within the Catholic Church or another church. So when does it arrive in a church? What is happening? Well, spiritual abuse occurs when someone, a pastor, a priest, a shepherd, or any other religious leader in a prayer group, a community or parish, uses his or her position of authority to control or dominate one or more persons. So you see, here it has to do with the person who abuses. If this person is a cleric, a religious, or even if he is a lay person, like for instance Vanier, who has a spiritual, let's say, a spiritual authority, automatically, if those persons abuse, there is a link to God, to the spirituality of the group or the church they represent. And this often results in a violation of the person's emotions, privacy, and opinions without regard to the negative consequences on the quality of the life and psychological and psycho-spiritual balance. They do, the abuse they commit is a spiritual abuse, but for that it's almost always also a link with psychology. They needed the psychology to groom, to manipulate someone. And that is also, and to do that, to manipulate someone, they try to control everything. The way they dress, the way they walk, the way they talk. You can see that there are several books written that are testimonies of adults who have been groomed and have been abused. So spiritual abuse is an abuse of authority that is further aggravated by the use of divine authority to dominate a person or persons. If you are a priest, and you know there is also this theology that normally should not be repeated too much because it has changed with Vatican II, but it's still very present, that the priest is the alter Christus, meaning he is the other Christ. So, of course, if you have that authority, then the things you say, it's like you say it as a divine authority because you are the other Christ, or in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. Of course, we all know that is what happens during the sacraments, but normally it has been used and abused by persons to see a priest as almost someone divine. So if he abuses, of course, there is this link with the spirituality, the theology, the way we look at God. So an example of spiritual abuse of adults is when they use spiritual arguments. So a second form of spiritual abuse is the use of spiritual arguments to achieve emotional, spiritual, or sexual gratification. In most cases, there are false arguments, such as the ones used by Jean Vanier. So one of the women tells us, when I expressed my astonishment, saying, how could I manifest my love to Jesus and to him, Vanier? He replied, but Jesus and myself, this is not true. We are one. It is Jesus who loves you through me. You see, if I said a moment ago that you have this identification with the divinity, with God, and the person, you see that it is also happening here by Vanier, who is a spiritual authority, although he's not a priest. But you see, he identifies himself with Jesus. So there are two forms of spiritual abuse. It is just because you are a Christian leader, because of that, the abuse is necessarily already a spiritual abuse. And secondly, you can also use spiritual arguments to justify the sexual abuse. So spiritual abuse, it's important to know, not necessarily leads to sexual abuse, but most of the time it is the waiting room. It is the beginning. It is that's the door they get in to get to sexual abuse. Okay, let's look at some consequences, but very shortly, because in another video we are going to explore that much more. But the consequences are on all levels of our humanity. There are physical consequences, there are pregnancy, there are sexual diseases. There are also psychological injuries, and most of us know the post-traumatic stress disorder, but we have to know that what is most normal, if I can say it like this, is depression. People who get abused have much problems with depression during their whole life if not treated. They have problems with relationships because they are not trusting, and also with the feeling powerless. So they, even during adulthood, if they have been abused as children, they think they can't do anything. They feel powerless. So it's also lots of work to get them to retake their power. And telling the story is normally the first step in that. And then we have the spiritual consequences. It's a twisted image of God. Some even say that we have an abusing God. And they have a problem with the sacraments. So if we have a priest who has abused, and you go to the parish after that to talk to them, they will ask if their marriage is valid, if the baptism of their children is valid. So although theoretically it should not touch the sacraments, that's not how people live it. They have a lot of problem with the sacraments, and maybe even most with the Eucharist, because they cannot imagine that hands who have been used to abuse a child are now touching the body of Christ. They have problems with people with authority, because they have seen how authority can be abused. And they often have also a feeling of guilt, because we have often the opposite mechanism. While the abuser should feel guilty and the victim not, we see that very often the abuser doesn't feel guilty and the victim does. So also working on guilt is important work for those who accompany victims. And to conclude, what to do? Well, first of all, if unfortunately the abuse has happened, we have to try and we have to help to heal the wounds of those who have been abused. It is a long way to go for them, and we should be there all the way, being present, listening, and helping in ways that they indicate to us. We have to contribute to justice. Pastoral care do not replace justice. Justice is also forgiveness does not replace justice. It's very important that justice happens. We have to do training and formation. That's what we are doing today, so that people understand that sexual abuse is really damaging to children, and that what are the consequences and what is abuse, people need to know. And not only what we are talking about today, but also how to denounce, where to denounce, and all those elements that come with it. And the best thing to do, of course, is prevention. Prevention should make it impossible for the abuse to happen. Of course, we will never be able to eliminate abuse for 100%, but we do know, and we have seen in the numbers, that there where prevention takes place, the numbers of abuse go down, they decrease. So that is something you also have to do. Do formation, follow formation, and work on prevention. Thank you for your attention.